Well, welcome back, everybody, to our final session in the Spirit Alive course we've been doing now for 7 weeks. It's hard to believe we reached session 7 of 7 here as we are concluding tonight our exploration of the encyclical Laudato Si, all of this great discussion we've had going deep, doing our deep dives into each chapter. And tonight are, in the fullest way, building on the work we've done, especially in the last 2 weeks, moving toward this idea of practice. So what does it look like for us to do Laudato Si and not just to read it and talk about it and pray with it and think with it, right? And to bring it into our hearts, but also to do it, to translate this vision into practice. That's really where we want this to go because, ultimately, and I think this is the first thing that we have to recognize as we begin tonight, ultimately, the ecological crisis is a deeply practical matter. It is a deeply practical matter. And, climate change and all of the realities that we're facing with respect to both, social forms of oppression and poverty that Pope Francis highlights, the dominance of certain economic systems that, affect people in certain ways, and then also all of the sort of ecological considerations we've been talking about: extinction, biodiversity loss, deforestation, rapidification. These systems walk hand in hand. And all of that really is about the kind of world that we live in. And that's the thing that I really hope tonight's session will drive home, that we're not just talking about ideas. We're not even just talking about our faith. We're not just talking about what it means to be Christian. We are talking about all those things, but we're also talking about the way that we live our lives, the way that our communities are structured, the way that we interact with each other. And when I say each other, I mean all the each others, right? Of every kind, of every species, of every sort, as we walk together as God's beloved creation, ever forgetting that we're all creation together, everything, everybody, whatever word you want to put there, all the birds, the rocks, the trees, us, the rivers, and everything else is caught up in this act of praise of God. And we are all creatures because we are all created. We are all held in being by God. And so we are all this thing we call creation. And so caring for creation, caring for our common home, is also caring for ourselves. And caring for ourselves is caring for creation. Those two things go hand in hand. And so as we really make, this final turn toward practice, this final turn toward integrating this vision we've been talking about, I want us to just keep remembering that this is ultimately practical. This is ultimately about how we live, the choices we make, what we do. And that's what we're going to dedicate our time to tonight, is brainstorming the way that we as individuals and as members of communities can live this out, ways that we can really make this happen and sort of sow the seeds of this bold cultural revolution that Pope Francis talks about and that we've been discussing for the last few weeks. So that's my very brief introduction to this. And I thought it would be appropriate for tonight's session, and I'll say more about kind of the format after we do this next thing, but I thought that for the purposes of tonight's session, it would be good to begin in prayer. Because, at the very end of Laudato Si, there are 2 beautiful prayers about creation. And I think that it's good for us to sort of sit with those and pray with those, reflect with those, and use that to kind of enter into this conversation. Because isn't it in prayer that we discover who we're called to be in relationship to the world around us and in relationship to God? Isn't it through that discernment that comes from that life of deep commitment to prayer, deep relationship to God, that we don't just sort of discern this sort of spiritual pie in the sky, but we also come to know who we are in relationship to the world around us? We come to know who we are in relationship to our Creator, and that teaches us how to live. That kind of discernment teaches us how to live. So I think it's appropriate with that in mind to begin with prayer. And I've asked 6 members of our group here have volunteered to lead us in this prayer tonight. And as we go through this prayer, what I invite you to do, kind of in the spirit of Lectio Divina, or a practice like that, a reflection on the words that we hear, listen carefully and really ask yourself, what are the words, what are the values, what are the virtues, whatever it is that jump out to me as I enter into this moment of prayer. What is God speaking to me, speaking to us as a church, as a community? And we're going to use those sort of things that come out of this experience of hearing and participating in this prayer as the basis for the first part of our discussion tonight of practices. So that's what I invite you into as we do this. And so I have the prayer now on the screen, and I invite us just into a moment of silence to kind of center ourselves, and then in the order that we discussed, we'll hear from our seminar participants this prayer by Pope Francis, a Christian prayer for creation. So let us pray together.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you.
Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you.
Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world towards the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you.
Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is.
God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live.
The poor and the earth are crying out, O Lord. Seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody, for leading us in this beautiful prayer. I think we'll take just a minute or so for everyone who's out there to just look at this prayer, look at the words, and reflect on what we've just heard. And I invite you out of this reflection again to sort of think about certain values or principles or virtues that if you were to build a movement rooted in Laudato Si, rooted in the vision that this prayer expresses, what would those be? What would those baseline values and virtues and commitments be? So we don't answer that question yet. Just take a minute, look over the words of the prayer, reflect for a bit, and come away with a couple of ideas, and then we'll begin to discuss. right. So I'm going to transition us from the prayer to this Google Doc that I have created. I'm going to have this up on the screen for the first part here. And after we finish, I'm going to ask Sister Maria, once I have a chance to clean this up, to send out the fruits of our labor here to everybody that's participated in this course, so that we all have something that we can take away. So it'll be a little PDF, that captures everything. And I've written you all a little note, and that'll be followed by 2 categories, which are basically going to be the 2 halves of our discussion tonight. The first one is what I was just talking about, the principles, virtues, and values for a bold cultural revolution. What are the bases for this movement that Pope Francis is suggesting? And then the second one is concrete practices to care for our common home. And we'll be talking about those in the second part, programs, initiatives, kind of things that we'll get to. But I think it's always good to kind of start with, what we're doing it for, and to remind ourselves that if we're going to have this bold cultural revolution, if we collectively as the Catholic Christian community are going to, bring Pope Francis's vision into reality and let it bear the fruit, literally and figuratively, right, that it intends to bear, it's important to keep ourselves grounded in principles and virtues and things like that. And I think that this prayer that we've just prayed is so full of those. And so it can be anything, it can be sort of a theological idea. It can be just simply as something like love and what that would mean, how you would understand that. Anything like that could go on this list of principles, virtues, and values for a bold cultural revolution. So for folks that are out there in the webinar space, I invite you as always to use the Q&A and chat in what your contributions are. We want to hear from everybody, and we will collect all of those and make sure that they make it here in sort of refined form into this document. So I'll start with one that I'm thinking about, and then I'll open it up to others. There's that great line, and here we are in the season of Easter, where Pope Francis says something like, help us to see the risen Christ in all creatures. And I think that that is just so bold. He says, you became part of this world, you gazed on the world with human eyes, which tends in a kind of anthropocentric direction. But then right after that, he says, today, you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. You're alive in every creature. And I wonder, again, we've talked a lot about perception. What would happen if that was our lens, to see the glory of the risen Christ alive in every creature? And here we have the Pope saying that that is true. That is the way the world is, that the glory of the risen Christ is present in every creature. I think that would be such a wonderful anchor, sort of principle for how we could see the world in a way that would lead to this sort of bold change that Pope Francis is suggesting we need. So I think that would be mine, this idea of seeing the risen Christ in all creation. So I want to open it up to the room and to folks out in the Q&A. What comes to your mind as we've said this prayer, as we've reflected on these last 6 weeks? What principles, virtues, values would you start us off with? Diane, please.
I think of reverence as, there might be a time when we're out in nature where there's something beautiful that evokes something within us. But reverence also, to me, speaks of acknowledging the other and appreciating, perhaps in a way that we haven't before, how to see something as a subject and not an object. And so I think reverence is something that's called forth within us. And at times, it might be something, I think it can be spontaneous. But I think as I'm speaking tonight, I also think of sometimes if there's someone that I'm not, let's say, in right relationship with, where is my reverence of the other person there? But I think first what the prayer evoked was just the creation of the world around us, and thinking of pictures of Ukraine and how that would be the opposite of what reverence is.
It's great. Beautiful, Diane. Thank you. We'll go to Frank next.
Yeah, the words that hit me today were teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of creation. And earlier today, I was meeting with one of our Laudato Si Action Platform teams, the one that helps me with discernment and leading the congregation forward. And that's pretty much what we were doing. We were talking about, as the encyclical mentions, there's a need for ecological conversion. And that's technically the challenge for this particular team is how do we help people experience an ecological conversion? And so what we were doing today was really recounting our own experiences of experiencing God, contemplating God in the beauty of nature, and talking about things like Thomas Berry calling it the first book of Revelation. And so it was such an exciting time for us today. We all felt much better about ourselves and what we can do to heal ourselves and the planet just after spending this time in an hour and 15, 20 minutes of conversation earlier today.
That's great, Frank. And I love that you've got a principle there, this finding beauty, and then also a practice, just a simple, parish roundtable conversation about finding beauty and how that can start to open up these levels of inspiration and act toward action. That's really great. Excellent. Thank you. We'll go to Virginia next.
So I think it's always important to ground all kinds of social justice actions in why do we do this, what is it for, and to ground it in. And I found it very exciting at the end of the document of the encyclical where he talked about our relationship to the Eucharist and to the triune God and how we're part of all that, and that I think if we can convey that in its totality, how that will help with the conversion, with the conversion of folks. So when I'd like to do something like that to ground people, and there's why should you do this and why it's important, and help them, and then they would be more willing to take the actions.
Absolutely. And Virginia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just to follow up on that, is there a particular something that you personally would say, this is what I would center on, this is what I think maybe we could focus on to bring about that kind of grounding? What would that be for you?
Well, I do a lot of work with small groups in my parish. So I was just thinking, if we could do some kind of activity or session where people can reconnect to the Eucharist. And that's an issue in the church right now. They say, oh, people don't believe in the real presence. And then, it's the real presence is everywhere, and of course, in a very special way in the Eucharist at the Mass. And then understanding people get very, don't understand the Trinity. And it's but if you really spend time with it, then you can get it. It's not that abstract, really.
That's great. So kind of getting back to theological basics and letting those real foundations of our tradition be the sort of entry point into this broader contemplation.
Right. So it's you have no choice, but if you're true to this, then you have no choice.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Let's go to Karen Kavanaugh. Karen, sorry, you're muted. You're on mute. The Zoom curse has struck. Karen, there you go. Oh, that looks like you hit the video control, but you'll want to hit the microphone next to that.
Mute.
There you are. There you are.
Okay, thank you. As the prayer was being prayed, I went in my own reflection to Pope Francis, but to the call to holiness. And you know how he gives us the two criteria or the pillars, and it's the Beatitudes and the final judgment. And I thought to myself, I've always only thought of them or prayed them in my relationship to other people, to my brothers and sisters in humanity. I don't know that I've ever prayed them or read them in light of all creation. And I was thinking of the Canticle of Francis, to go through Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Sister Water, and all of that. And so what I see a little bit as an action that I could do now that I'm working here at this place, because I will have interaction with a lot of young people, to put that out there to them, and blessedly to have the space to let them experience it at the same time. That it's the relationship is too far broader than to one another, and how nice we are to each other. And I think that could be something that could captivate them.
Well, I think that's really powerful. I mean, just imagining, kind of aligned with what Virginia was saying too, right? Reinterpreting these basic tenets of our faith, the Eucharist, the truth, you know, the real presence, but then the text, the Beatitudes, right? The sheep and goats, final judgment, Matthew 25, right? And saying, you know, well, Pope Francis has broadened the scope of who is my neighbor, you know, in this encyclical. And so, you know, that's a little intertextual thing, jumping from Luke to Matthew, but you know, this idea of neighbor, this idea of who will be saved, right? Who are we caring for? Who are we for? Yeah, broadening that category is a really wonderful grounding principle. That's great. Thank you, Karen. I want to just capture something that connects with what Frank was saying. Deborah Steedle in our chat had, you know, also was caught by the contemplating you in the beauty of the universe piece, and said, and Deborah, I just want to say to you, this is beautiful. Everything, every creature shows us the God of love. What a great little sentence, you know, everything, every creature shows us the God of love. That syncs up really well, I think, with this idea of the resurrection, the risen Christ, and everything we've been saying. So thank you for that. And others out there, if you're percolating ideas as we discuss, please send them in via the Q&A, because we'd love to get those as well. So let's go over to Maurice.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. By how you started us off today with that common creatureliness, every creature, like we just said. I was really impressed in the prayer how often the word all was used, maybe 5 or 6 times interspersed throughout those paragraphs of the prayer. I think it was Brian Swim that came up with the phrase comprehensive compassion. A compassion that's not just limited to us as humans, but indeed to all creatures. So yeah, going back to what you said about perception, how do we perceive the world? And the way we perceive the world is going to determine our actions and the way we think and act and pray. So rather than divisions between me and these other humans, or between me and the natural world, this prayer really emphasizes our common creatureliness, all inclusive. It challenges us straightforward, right, left, and center, all of us.
That's excellent. I love that emphasis on all. And, you know, think back to the subtitle of the encyclical, of course, right? Our common home. This is not something that is just our home. This is the home of everyone and everything that exists. And, you know, a lot of folks have brought in references over the course of the last 7 weeks to Robin Kimmerer's book. We keep coming back to Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's just so beautiful. But, you know, she talks in one chapter about having a friend, and then she adopts this practice of using the words everyone or people or them to start to talk about animals and trees and other things, right? So these categories that we have, like everyone rather than everything. Well, what if we, back to this idea of subjects and objects that we were talking about, that folks are drawing out of Thomas Berry, right? to see something as a subject in a sense is to see it as an everyone, as a part of everyone, even if it's not human. And you know, I just can't help but my imagination goes back to Saint Francis of Assisi talking to the birds and the wolves and, you know, all these things. He saw other creatures as, you know, someone, and not just something. And I think that that distinction, like being able to recognize and bring out and live according to that sort of someoneness of the little birds that sit on our patio in the morning or whatever it is a real powerful revolution in our consciousness, in our perception, that can bring about, you know, those things. Because before Francis could preach to the birds, he had to assume, right? In order to do that, he had to know that they were capable of hearing the preaching and to see them as, you know, subjects, to see them as creatures who he could engage with in that way. And he chose to do that. So I think there's something really neat in that you're pointing us toward, Maurice. That's great. Thanks. Let's go over to Tom.
Well, before I was a part of this class, I was very practical and I was more of an implementation type of person. But after the 7 weeks of being together with you all, I've learned that, you know, the spirituality that goes along with the self-conversion that Paul just spoke about is so important as our moral compass to get ourselves in the direction of where we love all things and care about all things. And once we get there, we'll do something that will be able to be positive, like St. Francis of Assisi did. He was a man of poverty. He was a man of peace. He was a man who cared and loved for creation. I really think he's our idol in many ways. And of course, Pope Francis, who took his name. So I would add morality focused on human dignity and two special words, the common good, that we all deserve and that we all need to give. And when we get people in the right place and feel this way, then I believe we'll make more progress. And I hope that's what happens in these international meetings that are coming up, like the one COP 27 in Egypt this year. So I want to thank you all because I've had a conversion from being implementation and trying to practically address these things. But before you do, you have to have a conversion of heart.
Yeah, what a beautiful reflection. And I hear that, Tom. You know, we so often are formed right into these practices like recycling or something like that. Or that's not your kind of practice. I mean, you're on a very different level than most of us because this has been your work, right? But you know, on the everyday, people think about composting or recycling or, you know, cooking in certain ways, eating certain things and not others. But really what we kept hearing, I think, from Pope Francis, and what I know I tried to keep emphasizing as we talked about it, was this idea that we need this deep level conversion. And I think that, you know, we never really talked that much about this idea of morality, you know, and often in the Catholic context, when we think about morality, you know, the things that come to mind are, you know, living a good life, loving your neighbor, sex, you know, these kinds of things, the kind of things, the classical moral theology categories, right, come to mind. But what Catholic social teaching gives us, and I think what you highlighted there so well, Tom, is that ultimately all morality, right, all morality is oriented toward the fundamental recognition of the dignity of creatures, one, and work in service of the common good of the dignity of all creatures, two, right? And so if we were to say, yeah, we have a morality as Christians. There is a Christian morality, and that Christian morality is centered on care and love and peace and those things that you named that St. Francis exemplified. And everything that we do, the way that we choose to live, the way that we choose to act, what gets preached from our pulpits and read in our, in our homilies, those kinds of things, but in our universal prayer and the intercessions, worship, in our classrooms, in our teaching, can teach this morality that's not just about like, X, Y, and Z things that it's always been about, but about this broad encompassing sense of being part of a community, and that our fundamental, need is to love and care for that community. And Maria Nowotny in the chat, in the Q&A from out in the webinar, just said, it's about respect, because God, in God's love, created all things and is present in all. And that sort of deep-seated respect that comes from that sort of revolution of vision, I think, is a really powerful thing. So rethinking what it means to be moral, rethinking morality, and not giving up that category, but expanding that category, recontextualizing that category in light of the present moment, and including creation in that time. I think that's a really wonderful sort of principle to guide it. It's great. Thank you. All right, we'll go to Barbara and go there next.
Okay, can I shift and can we talk a little bit about the platform, the action platform?
Sure. There's going to be a lot more time for that in like 5 minutes. But
Okay,
so if you
I'll
want
wait
to,
that.
okay,
Yeah.
I'll have you go first when we shift over to that. Thank you, Barbara. And let's go to Judy. Oh, Judy, you're muted. Sorry.
When the prayer was being read, what struck me was, Jesus, you became part of this earth. And I had this deep sense, not just of Jesus walking on the earth, but really becoming part of the earth, as you keep saying, dirt and breath. And then there's that other line that says that we may feel profoundly joined to everything there is. And it called me to really a deeper sense of, I don't want to say solidarity, but just oneness with all creation, and to recognize, to be aware of that in my dealings with all of creation, that I am profoundly joined, and my actions need to reflect that. And it reminded me of that conversation in an earlier, one of the earlier classes about solidarity versus stewardship, which I really want to look into some more, because I thought that was really important. That it is this, for me, this part is even deeper than solidarity, this oneness. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful, Judy. Thank you. And this deep sense of connection, and what you're kind of touching on, many theologians have commented on. A man named Niels Gregerson has written on this, and he gets picked up by authors like Dennis Edwards, if people are familiar with the work of Dennis Edwards, the ecological theologian, and Elizabeth Johnson, as well, whom we've mentioned many times. The sort of concept that I'm hearing you talk about is this thing, and I'll put the term in the chat here. If you want to explore it further in any of these authors, you can look into this. Sorry, I wrote the wrong thing. So second thing first. The first part of it is what we call deep incarnation, what theologians call deep incarnation. That in the incarnation, Jesus doesn't just walk on the earth, as you said, Judy, but is one with the matter of the earth. And typically the argument for this is that if we take an evolutionary perspective and an ecological perspective, Jesus's material body, Jesus's physical embodiedness shares in the same history, the same evolutionary history, and the same ecological interconnectedness that all matter in the universe shares. So this idea that Christ is becoming flesh is bigger than just becoming human flesh. Christ is becoming the whole evolutionary history of human flesh. All the dirt, all of the atoms, all the molecules since the time of the Big Bang are made, are part of the incarnation of Jesus into the world. And so this is what theologians call deep incarnation, because it's not just incarnation and sort of like taking on human flesh, but taking on flesh as it is connected to that whole history and to all of matter, into that whole history. Now, what Johnson in particular elaborates on then is that, and this is kind of what made me think what I was thinking about when I said the thing about the risen Christ in all creation is that if there is deep incarnation, then there must also be deep resurrection. The idea that everything is lifted up through the resurrection because it's Jesus's body, his physical body, with all of its interconnectedness to everything else, that brings about the resurrection and then is resurrected. So the crucifixion brings us into that. And so Christ's resurrection becomes the primary symbol of the resurrection of the whole creation. And I think that that implies deep ethical responsibilities if we are a resurrection people, in terms of how we live, how we choose to move in the world, and all of those kinds of things. So I would just, Judy, you were talking about those ideas in sort of your own way, and I wanted to make sure that those concepts are out there. So, folks that I mentioned there are Gregerson, Edwards, and Johnson would be 3 people to read if you're interested in exploring these ideas further as we go forward. So that's great. We'll go to Colleen, and Colleen will be our last person in this first round here. But before I do that, I want to just lift a couple things out of the chat. I love that Christina Matone has given us this reference to Kimmerer again, who speaks of the tree or the rock, kind of we were talking about with the someone language, as kin rather than thing. Right. And again, as kin rather than things, our brothers and sisters, right? Very familial language, just like we see in Francis of Assisi and Pope Francis. Barb Winsick has said that in the prayer, the thing that captured her was this phrase, "Seize us with your power and light." What a beautiful image. Seize us with your power and light. And Barb says, what a challenge to reflect on and to integrate these concepts in my daily life out of love, not out of destructive power. So being kind of taken up by God's power and understanding that that is the power of life and love, and that motivates us to greater action, I think is great. And then finally, we have from Maria Nowotny, the idea of restraint coming back. We've talked a little about this in the past, but restraint in every aspect of life, being mindful not to use more than is necessary, and not, and I think this is so good, being induced to believe that we need more than what is necessary for our existence, because that's kind of the message we're always receiving, is that we need more. And all of that does is it leads, as Francis says, to that frustration, that sense of never being fulfilled, always wanting, needing more. Why can't I have, blah, blah, blah. And that leads to this consumer, this anxious consumerism that we talked about a lot last time, that is at the heart of so much of this. Last thing here, Bonnie, right at the very beginning, had simply show us our place in the world, humility, in the chat. And I think that is so good as well, to have that reminder to be humble before creation, knowing our place in the world and not living above that place, because our place is our interconnectedness. That's where it comes from. So we'll go to Colleen, then we'll quick transition, and we'll go to Barbara to kick us off on the action platform and practical kind of things we can do. So Colleen, please.
So I love that word restraint. I was going to say that I'm looking for a word, of a value-based word that counters the value system that got us to this point, that got us to this crisis. So we talk about the value of money and power and competition and economic advantage. And I was looking for what's the opposite of that. I often think of when is enough enough. I love the word restraint. I think that is it's a good message to those of us who live in first world society, that, the concept of ever consuming and, having too much is probably not a good thing. So I applaud the chat comment on the word restraint. I'm going to use that one. Thanks.
That's great, Colleen. Thank you. And thank you to Maria for bringing that in as well. Maria, thank you so much for bringing in that word. Excellent. All right. So we have such a beautiful catalog, wonderful catalog of values, virtues, principles that we're going to ground these in. And what I'm going to do after the session in the next day or so is just kind of, write everything up nicely and translate these into sort of virtues that capture our discussion. And my hope is that these can then turn into foundations for action. These can then become the basis for our parish programs or our university programs, or what we're doing in our schools, or wherever it is, our families, wherever we live, wherever we sort of live our relationship to our common home. Because I think that and Tom, I think you captured this really well, that whenever we boil this down, these are things that we can teach. These are things that we convey, that when we internalize them and let them be sort of our grounding basis for understanding what it means to be people who follow Jesus Christ, it brings about this revolution. And I'll keep using that word, a revolution of our gaze, a change in how we see, and then a revolution of our culture. Because once we change how we see, we can change the whole structure of how we live and move and all those things. So if that's the case, this connection between perception and practice, is going to hold, then I want to turn us to practice. And I want to use the rest of our time tonight basically to say, what do we do with this now? How do we activate this? How do we, use a business word, operationalize, right, this vision, and make it something that we can do together? So Barbara, you were going to turn us toward the platform. And so I'd love for you to talk a bit about that and your own thing to get us started.
Okay. So the platform assumes everything that we've been saying. So it's not different, but it moves into a sort of different mode if we used a musical analogy from major to minor or something like that. Here's my way of just saying what I think it is. We're used to, I bet, the Roman Catholic Church being sort of a large organization that operates top down, can get the word out and make things known and so forth. I think what's happened with Laudato Si, in not right away, but in the several years that it's been in our hands and on our bookshelves and so forth, the effort is to say, how could the Roman Catholic Church be a sort of place where all the practical things that need to happen can well up, not just from Catholics, but from people of goodwill all over the world. And so I think the urgency of needing to act that we've talked about before, that people in Rome, and I'll just say in Rome, because it really does come out of a dicastery in Rome, have gotten the idea of thinking in terms of a platform that people can join, can sort of swim over to and climb onto with their projects and hopes and so forth. So the platform becomes the quasi-organized, but grassroots welling up way that the practical things that so urgently need to be done can get talked about, owned, named, signed up for, and that groups can begin to act in ways that actually make the change possible. So one of the salient things about the platform, besides that it is a grassroots effort that is growing up within the sort of loose organization of the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a great action on the part of the church to allow it to grow up from the roots and sort of grow into the organization, is to say, how can we organize all of the efforts so that in fact they accomplish something? And so the last thing I want to say here is that the analogy that they use is, one of the analogies is, at what point did it become clear that the Berlin Wall was going to fall? So people talked about it for decades, hoped about it, prayed for it, and so forth. But then at some point, actions moved toward getting it to happen. And as the actions and talk accumulated in a sort of organized way, more people began to believe it. So what I think the Laudato Si Action Platform is trying to organize is a huge forum where, in fact, we can ground all of our wonderful intentions and somewhat quantify them and measure them. So the Action Platform is a way to try to organize this huge project. And I think it's important that we figure out how to participate. It's not easy to participate because of the complexity. But even to do one little thing, but to hook it to the platform so that we aren't platforming out by ourselves and hoping that somebody notices. We're really joining and working together. And there's a real effort to do that. So that's my start on the platform. It's going to actually happen and be photographable or measurable or whatever.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I love that you use that swimming metaphor, swimming over to this platform, right? We don't want our platform to be way out. We should be able to see the other little platforms in this ocean or this lake that we're all swimming in together. And that's what the website, provides for. And I mentioned it last week, but I also, I'll drop it in the chat again. But I also have it in this document that I'll send out, that web address, so that everybody can go there and get connected. Although for some reason right now, it doesn't look like the website is working. Hopefully they fix that soon. I don't know what's going on with that, Vatican. But the idea here, right, is that it's an opportunity for resources to be shared. And I think, Barbara, what you said up front, that we are used to in the church, this sort of hierarchical top-down way of things working. Well, Laudato Si comes from the Pope, but now the Laudato Si as an encyclical, right? As this encyclical, it inspires this grassroots bottom-up movement. And that's the only way we're going to get things done. Because if we all sit around waiting for Pope Francis to tell us what to do, it's going to be too late. And so we have to get moving on this now. There are people who know how to do this stuff already. So, it doesn't have to just be Catholics. Listen to other people of goodwill, et cetera, et cetera. The platform is an opportunity for networking, learning from each other, saying, oh, there's a parish in Wisconsin doing this. I want to do that. Let's get it going here. So use that resource. And that's such a great call to action there, Barbara, on behalf of what the platform is, what it does, what it can provide. So everybody, please enroll once the website is back up, and get going on that, because it's such a great resource. All right, so now we're talking concrete. We're talking concrete practices, programs, initiatives. What can we do? So let's get our heads out of the sky and really come down to the ground and say, as grassroots people, as Barbara was just saying, trying to turn this into practice, what can we do? What are people doing? And we'll talk about that. So we'll have Diane start us off.
One of the things that we did in our religious congregations, that's Dominican Sister in Amityville, is leading up to the platform and leading up to our public commitment. What we felt would be helpful would be to remind ourselves of what was already taking place within the congregation. So we tracked back, I think about 25 years or 30 years, and we took the 7 goals of the action platform, and we placed under those goals things, actions that we had already taken, or things that already had been done, so that we could get a grasp a little bit more easily, is that this is not something totally new. This is something that we have been about. And so it can foster or encourage new efforts or new thinking, but we felt that that was helpful for us, and I think it has been.
That's great, Diane. And what I would say, if I'll add one thing on to that, when I've done work with parishes, with religious communities, with all kinds of different, in having conversations about these things, I love the idea, because it's sort of like doing what, in business, what people call a SWOT analysis or something, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. Strategic planning people know about this kind of stuff, right? But one of the things that can be so great that I love that you're doing, Diane, is taking this inventory of what we're already doing, okay, what a community is already doing. And this could be a school or a parish, and using the 7 pillars, right, of the action platform, using these principles of what we've talked about, and as categories. And it's okay, well, in this set of ministries, we do this. In how we source our food, well, that goes under here. In the way that we do this kind of outreach, that goes here. And the way that we get our bread for the Eucharist, well, that goes here. All of these different things. And you kind of have a sense of here's where our community's life is. And I'm using community in a broad sense, not just in a religious community, but again, a school, a parish, a workplace, it could be anything, and then you say, maybe step 2 then, and this is the part I'll add on to what Diane was suggesting is, okay, what have we not captured here, right? What are the other elements that of our everyday existence that are not captured in here? And what category would they belong in? And if we want those things that we do in our everyday life to achieve the vision or be closer to the vision of Laudato Si, what steps do we need to take to align our practice with the principle and what this is supposed to be all about? So this could be like, how do we feed our students at school? How do we, are we using, the Poland Spring bubbler thing, right, in the office? Or is there a way that we could simply get a water purifier that we hook up to a sink and, we don't have to get those big plastic bottles of water anymore? There's no need for that. Just get a nice water filtration system, call the Culligan man or whoever, and, and look into these other options, right? That people can use. And to do that, Maria just brought in things like school uniforms can be thought about in this term. That's a great example, right? In a context how are they being produced? Who's making them? What are the processes, right? Are our school uniforms just bananas in disguise, right? Thinking about that, the banana labor kind of issue that we were talking about. So creating these categories, thinking about what we are doing, and then thinking about what we're not doing, maybe along the lines of, what I have done and what I have failed to do, but, like playing with that. And then rethinking, okay, how can our actions, our everyday actions, better align with these principles? That's one way of forming a localized action plan. That's our own action platform that says, here's who we are, here's what we do. Do we need, I mentioned the water thing because that's something I did in our office on campus. We used to bring in those big tanks of water, and you have to lift it and put it on the thing and then they get refilled. I was like, can we just please get rid of this? Like, all we're doing is bringing plastic and all this other stuff into our thing. Let's just get a water filtration system and hook it up to the sink. And we did, and everybody loves it. And it's super easy to use, so like little things like that, as Bonnie was saying in the chat, committing to one thing can be such a great way to do that. So that's my little like riff on your comment, Diane, in terms of, looking back at what we're doing and then looking forward to what we can do. In every aspect of our lives. Can we grow some of the food that we're eating rather than purchasing it and outsourcing it? Can we think about how we do laundry and the water that it takes to do laundry and to wash the dishes in our community or our school or whatever it is? These are things that we don't often think about, but we can think about. And I think having those framing principles can be really good for that. That's great. Let's go over to Karen Burke.
Thanks, Paul. Paul, I'd like to start with just what Barbara was talking about with partnerships and probably just lift up at this moment. One of the things the Pope has pointed toward Indigenous people as being the principal dialogue partners, and that we really need to look toward our Indigenous brothers and sisters to be our dialogue partners right now. So I just like to lift up an initiative here on Long Island, and great to speak after Diane has spoken, because Diane's part of that partnership of women religious, really partnering with other environmental groups, organizations, various people on Long Island, and looking toward the Indigenous people of Long Island, in particular the Shinnecock people from the eastern end of Long Island, and sitting back, listening to them, hearing their message, their relationship with earth, with land, and what can we learn from them, and how do we walk together with our Indigenous brothers and sisters right now. So it's a wonderful initiative. It's getting started in various ways. It's been happening just in looking at our waters, looking at the opportunities, kelp farming here on Long Island with the Shinnecock women, looking at housing initiatives on the reservation, looking at future of land that's owned by women religious and religious congregations on Long Island, but just various options. And just, I think all of it has been the emphasis start with relationship, building relationship, having these opportunities where you can sit down on a Sunday afternoon and have a taco with a group of Indigenous women here on Long Island, and building those relationships as a way for us to hear, listen, learn, and move toward the future, making decisions. So it's just, it's a wonderful moment right now for us that I just wanted to lift up as part of us coming together. So thanks.
That's so beautiful, Karen. Thank you. And what I want to lift up in that I hear that was so central in our conversations about the encyclical is this merger of social and ecological justice, this merger of, you know, those two things coming together. Because when we talk about indigenous communities, right, we can't separate ourselves from the legacy of the violence and the destruction of those communities that came often, you know, in the name of Christianity. And, you know, let's be honest, like Pope Francis says a lot about Indigenous wisdom and our need to care for our Indigenous brothers, sisters, but he never acknowledges that history in Laudato Si, the legacy of colonialism being tied to, you know, the conversion of Indigenous peoples. It never gets mentioned, you know. And I think that, Karen, so what you're doing, what a movement like that does is it offers these opportunities for new connections, new relationships, and also for new ways of doing justice to people that have been historically marginalized, even by Christianity and by sort of Christian, you know, imperial sort of thinking. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, if we're going to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, you know, one of the statistics, if you look up the poorest counties in the nation, they very often, I think it's the top 2 or 3 correspond, or at least 2 of the top 3 correspond with Indian reservations. They are Indian reservations in South Dakota and New Mexico, Arizona, places like that. So, you know, whenever we think about that legacy, these kinds of partnerships are not just, I mean, they are good grassroots kind of coming together, but they're also opportunities to right wrongs and to build new relationships. And I think that we can't lose sight of that, you know, that the need to do that kind of thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is so important on this question of partnerships is this. So often, and we know this, right, we live in an increasingly divided society, especially here in the United States, and these sort of bifurcations between, you know, the environmental movement and the church, or these kinds of things, they're out there, you know. But what I heard Barbara say early on, when you were framing up the platform, what you said so well and reminded us of is that at the very beginning of the encyclical, Pope Francis says, why am I a pope, you know, saying that I'm writing this document to all people of goodwill? And Pope Francis says, well, I am writing to all people of goodwill. And the reason for that is because this is a concern that affects everyone, right? And we can't live with these dichotomies and keeping, you know, that movement over there because of their stance on X, Y, or Z, or keep those people over there because they're, you know, too inclusive or something like that. Like I think what Francis is saying is forget about all that and just come together and get the work done. Like that's what we have to do. And so I think there's a call to sort of courage and a call to a real authentic sort of willingness to sort of, like Jesus did, you know, go out to the margins, go out beyond, you know, the limits of what is supposedly acceptable in this or that context, and do what needs to be done to care for the world and to care for each other. And I think that kind of call is really intrinsic to our Christian call, but so often it gets lost in this scuffles about, you know, turf and territory and who's allowed to say what and who's, you know, those kinds of things. Forget all that, please. Like, walk away from this class saying, like, I'm not going to care about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build partnerships, because, you know, that also is the essence of spreading the good news of who we are as Christians, because others are going to learn from us and our commitments too, whenever we are able to overcome those barriers and really get in and do the work together. You know, so that's the second thing that, Karen, you brought to mind for me as I'm reflecting on your great initiative there. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to Frank.
Yeah, one of these other teams that we've set up to work on the Laudato Si Action platform started from the principle of simple living, and they began to think about food. And one of the things they did was read a book written by one of your colleagues, I believe, Mary McGann, The Meal That Reconnects. And from reading that book, at our recent chapter, they challenged the whole congregation to go meatless on Mondays and Fridays. Now, we've talked about that, and it's always been resisted, especially by the older sisters in the mother house. But all of a sudden, a week after the chapter, they met and they took a vote, and all of a sudden they were excited about having meatless Mondays and Fridays. And so it's a simple thing in terms of it's affecting mainly the women in the house, but so many other people in the congregation are doing the same thing. I was running a house of hospitality at the time, and we started the immigrants in the house being made aware of what's going on and honoring the commitment that the congregation was made. The congregation was hosting them. So it was an important thing and a simple ask, but it makes a difference. And even in our house, helps us remember what day of the week it is, and it's Monday. Well, can't eat meat today. Another thing, you talk about partnerships. One of the things that our congregation tried to do, one of the things we are doing is impact investing. And one of the concerns that came up a couple of years ago was about the people in Yemen who were starving and cholera was being spread. And, we didn't know how actually to go about getting money and financing to a group in Yemen that could actually affect change. And so what we did is actually put the money people who manage stuff for the congregation in charge of looking for organizations that we could work with that would enable the congregation to make impactful donations to the people of Yemen. And the amazing part of this is the money people got excited about the challenge, and they managed to find, eventually we wound up working, I think, through Catholic Relief Services, but it was really through, nominally it was through Catholic Relief Services, but it was through the Islamic Relief Societies that a lot of the work was being done. But the beauty of that is, from the grassroots here, it's now moving up into raising the consciousness of people in the financial communities about what can be done that's not being done now.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, and the fact that you bring in the financial communities and investing and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, often and partly this is probably because I don't know as much about those kinds of things, and partly it's because I tend to be suspicious of these things, as you can probably tell from our last 6 weeks. But I think that those systems and those folks are integral parts of how the world works, and in some ways maybe too integral, somebody could argue. But at the same time, if the resources of financial markets and financial expertise can be leveraged in favor of this, imagine the change that could take place. I often have students who will say, sustainability is great. These are, business majors or something will say, sustainability is great. I'm all for it. How do we make it marketable? Because once you do that, once you can sell it, then, you'll be able to get people on board and do that. Now, I immediately kind of come back with, but is that really the right way to go? Do we really want to make sustainability another thing that needs to be sold? That's not what Pope Francis is saying. I mean, he says we need to change our hearts and live differently. And at the same time, we have to live within the sort of consumer system that we are part of. And I think there are ways to do that creatively and to leverage those resources in ways that really have an impact. And I think, Frank, you're attesting to with the Yemen thing, which has been a huge crisis. I mean, a huge crisis, and really undiscussed in most sort of news agencies in the US. We haven't heard a lot about the Yemen stuff, but if you're not familiar with it, look into it. The crisis that's been going on there is just awful, and so it's great to make those connections. So good. Well, I'll throw in a couple ideas here, and I'm still open. Please use the Q&A. Please bring in ideas. If other folks in our group here have practical, concrete things, I'll take my turn and throw in a couple of things here. So the first one, and I think maybe this is partially informed by living in California, but it's also more largely informed by the fact that I grew up with, parents and relatives who were farmers and gardeners and who were always growing food, throughout the year. Now, easier said than done in certain contexts. It depends on your climate and all those kinds of things. Out here in California, we are blessed with a 12-month-a-year growing season. We can grow food all year round. And you can't grow everything all year round. Now, that's different from New York, where a lot of folks here are located, New Jersey, New England. Pretty different. You can't grow as much in the winter as you can, in the spring and summer months. But I think for two reasons that a program oriented toward growing your own food is one of the most important things we can do and we can start. And I think everybody can do it. I really do. I want to say that again. I really believe that everybody can do this, okay? Whether it is starting with herbs at home, starting with herb garden, you can do an indoor herb garden on your windowsill. There are heat lamps if you need heat. Start with herbs, start with little plants, start with little onions. Get your hands in the dirt and let life start to kind of spark and grow. It's like the bean experiment in fourth grade, that like every fourth grader grows a bean and it sprouts, right? This practice is so far away from our everyday practice, and great, Bonnie, I'm glad you brought this in. Sorry, I'll drop this link in the chat. Bonnie has just said, everybody can grow food all year round. It's true. Here is a website that talk about that. But thinking about this practice, the reason why I emphasize this is because there's something about that practice of having your hands in the dirt and the act of watering and checking in on your plants and seeing how the basil's doing that changes the way that we look at the world in really deep and profound ways. And it's just the simple act. Now, here's the thing, statistically speaking, right? 100 years ago, over 50% of people in the United States of America farmed or grew, gardened at least a substantial portion of the food that they ate, over 50% 100 years ago. Today, that number is less than 2%, all right, of people in the United States do that kind of work. Now, think about that. Why is that? Well, because after World War II, we get the rise of the supermarket, sort of complex. And in the 1950s, all of this is part of the growth of communities after this time of, great, true turmoil, right? But what got lost, in the shuffle? Well, I think our connection to the earth got lost in the shuffle. I think our understanding of how life works and the beauty and the wonder and the awe that you can have whenever you can raise that thing and then have a delicious set of herbs or a beautiful ripe tomato to eat in the summer or whatever it is. So garden. Now, that's the first thing. Now, we can all do this at home. Bonnie, thank you for the suggestions on the websites and things like this, ways we can start to do this. The other thing I would say is that let's make this a Laudato Si action platform thing now. Okay, nearly every parish in our country probably has a little plot of land somewhere sitting around. There's a tree growing in the parking lot, and around it there's dirt. Back behind the rectory, there's a little yard, a little plot of land, whatever it is. Yards, and you'll hear me rant about yards a lot. In my opinion, positively stated, yards are just gardens waiting to be grown. Yards are just gardens waiting to be grown. So on every school plot, on every parish property, there probably is land, even if it's like a 8x8 square, doesn't have to be big, 9x9 square, exactly, that can be converted, as Bonnie is saying, into food production. Every lawn can be converted into a food production space. Now, what does that do? Well, it does two things. The first is that it allows for the creation of parish and school and community programs where everybody's out there working in the dirt, and you get a family to sign up every week or 3 times a week to come and check in on the plants for an hour, do the harvesting when it's time to harvest, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes a parish program. It becomes a school program very, very, very easily, very easily. The second thing that and it's like, why do we need to be reminded of this? But food gardens feed hungry people. And there are hungry people in our parishes. There are people who are poor in our parishes and in our school communities who don't have access to healthy food on a regular basis. There are people in our communities, even if we are in an affluent area where everybody actually does have enough, there are people in our communities who would benefit, homeless shelters or whatever it might be, that we could donate the food that we grow to in order to feed hungry people. And here again, this is a place, I think, in the act of gardening where that ecological and social justice can come together. And we can do food justice by taking our little 8x8 or 12x12 plot of yard that we have sitting somewhere on our property and starting to grow food. You would be amazed at how much food can be grown on a 12x12 square of land. If you've never done it before, once you learn kind of how to set it up, the amount of food that you can produce on just a small plot is wonderful, is incredible. And it can be shared, it can be eaten, it can be used for, our programs, and things like that. You can cook your own food. You can send it home with kids that need healthy food, at home. And it becomes such an opportunity to bring together that vision of ecological social justice into one thing. So that's my first thing, is gardening. Do it, build a parish or school or community program that just says, all we have is this little square of land. Well, let's grow some food on it. You can do it and see what can be done with that. It can be a really powerful thing. The second thing I would just want to mention, kind of in relationship to what we were just talking about with meat consumption, and Mary McGann's work and other things like that, is just that, and I think I said this before a few weeks ago, but by most estimates, right, cutting your meat consumption, individual person's meat consumption 3 times a week, 3 days a week, so 3 meatless days a week, can reduce your individual carbon footprint by 35% or more. All right. Now think about that on a family scale or on a community scale, whereas Frank is saying you have 3 meatless days a week or 2 meatless days a week. When you blow that up to a community level, the impact is huge. The impact is huge. So thinking about that, right, that ability to be able to sort of say, okay, restraint, right? We're not going to eat meat 3 times a week. We don't need to eat meat 3 times a week. And also, there's so much delicious vegetarian food. I just had the idea as you were talking, Frank, I'm going to send out some recipes with this guide that I would love for people to make. Vegetarian lasagnas, Lebanese dishes with lentils and rice. I mean, there's so many wonderful, wonderful things, so much good Indian food. And if you've ever had this experience of eating vegetarian food from a predominantly vegetarian culture, you know that it can be delicious and nutritious and wonderful. It doesn't have to taste like lack, as I like to say. It doesn't have to taste like something is missing. There are methods that are tried and tested to be able to do that. And so those are 2 little things, what we're eating, where we're getting our food from. I really think that this return to thinking intentionally about food is one of the most profound things we can do, because all of the factors that we talk about when we talk about the ecological crisis are fueled in large ways by the food industry. And Maria Iannucci, I'll bring in your point here. You also said weeds are also, the things we call weeds are also food and medicine. Yes, that is so true. As I've heard Norman Wiersbe, who I mentioned before, ecological theologian, say, weeds are just misunderstood plants, right? We created the category of weed. There is no scientific category weed as opposed to plant. We made that up because they're like invasive or they get in the way, but they also have beautiful, they beautiful flowers and they provide so many benefits. So again, rethinking these things, practical strategies. We've got so much good stuff to think with. So anyway, we're at our time. And I just want to conclude tonight bringing in Christina Matone's point, square foot gardening. Look that up. It's a wonderful way to think about what we were talking about in conjunction with what Bonnie shared. Thank you all, those I see and those I cannot see, for all of your wonderful contributions and participation. Spread the gospel of, creation. Spread the good news of this to everybody, and know that we can do this work together, and we must do this work together, both as part of our call as followers of Jesus and as people who live in a world that needs this deep, bold cultural revolution. So my deepest gratitude to everybody who's taken part in the course. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we will send you
And
some
Paul,
coming days. Yeah.
I want to say on behalf of everybody who's been in the class, thank you. Around Brentwood, where I'm from, my community, we a lot of St. Joseph have logged on. It's all been complimentary. People have written in to say how grateful they are for everything that you've contributed. So I want everybody to know that Paul will be back. I arranged to have him come back next. I think it's the end of April and May, right?
About a year from now.
But I just want to take a minute to talk to everyone who's enrolled here. In about the next week or 10 days, I'm going to post on the Spirit Alive website a preview of coming attractions next fall, starting on October 11th, which is the 60th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. We are going to launch an 8-month webinar series with some of the top theologians / ecclesiologists in the country and outside the country internationally. And I hope you'll be interested in that. The vision of Vatican II is what attracted many of us to the church, to service in the church. And that vision has to be kept alive despite some contrary waves currently in the church. So I think that's going to be great. It's going to start with Paul Lakeland from Fairfield University on October 11th and go through the documents and many other things. In conjunction with that, in the fall, I'm going to have 3 roundtables. The church the boomers want, the church Gen Zers and younger millenniums want, and the church that older millenniums and Gen Xers want. So that's going to be good. And then starting next January, we'll have courses again, as we do now. Barbara Green, who has joined us in this class and has complained about how the church uses scripture. I said, Barbara, you're going to have to teach a course. So she'll be teaching a course for us in January. There's another one on the Passion narratives as a paradigm for discipleship that's going to be coming up in March. And Paul is going to do his thing on Bible and ecology. And those are just some of the programs that we have. So I look forward to having you all come back. We have your addresses and we only use them to contact you to let you know what's going on. Everything is sponsored by my community and free. If you'd like to make a donation to Spirit Alive website to keep the programming going, fine. If you don't, we are going to make this happen because we believe it's very important contribution to the church to bring these kinds of programs where we have space to really think and wrap our heads around some of the urgent and important issues of our day. So I hope to see you all again. You're all part of our Spirit Alive community, especially you, Paul, a very memorable part of our community. And I hope you'll, and I know you'll be happy to come back and join us. And we'll be thrilled to have you back. So thank you, Paul.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.